Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about the type function as well as go into a little more detail on basic type casting. We will start with the type function since it is pretty straightforward. We can pass variables into the function and it will return the variable's type. This is a very useful function to have in Python, especially when variables can be anything at any time. The type function on its own is good for debugging as we can use the type function directly in a print statement, like you see here in these examples. This is useful because if you have a variable causing errors due to its type, you can check the type of the variable throughout the code until you find where its type unintentionally changed. So if I run these examples here, it prints out their proper type. So we got the integer, we got the float, we got the string, we got the Boolean, and we've got the list. And then as you can see here, I also checked an element inside of the list, which is also an integer. However, we can also use the type function to control how code is executed on variables. Here's a simple example right here that shows that in action. Don't worry about understanding the code just yet. I will be going over if statements next time, and I will revisit this example when I do. But for now, what the statement does is it checks the type of variable a and sees if it's an int or if it's something else. If it's an int, then it will print out the message that it's an integer. If it's not, then it will print out the message that it's not an integer. So if I run this code here with a equal to 1, we're going to get the message that a is in fact an integer. But if I were to change the value of a to something that wasn't an integer, such as a float, and then run it again, we get the message that a is not an integer. Now let's talk about casting. I mentioned casting a few times in the video on data types, but I wanted to go into more detail on the subject. I also will only be covering simple typecasting because for data structures, converting data can be a little bit more involved. I'll cover more advanced data conversion in other videos in the future though. Casting is the act of taking data of one type and converting it into another type. One example I had demonstrated before was casting non-string types to a string type. So we'll start with a quick review of string casting. Pretty much every data type and structure can be cast into string type. One reason why we would do this is usually so that we can use them in a print statement or a login statement with other strings, like you see here. If we print out our statements like this using concatenation, we would have to cast the variables to string types, otherwise we would get an error saying that we can't concatenate this value with a string. In fact, I'm going to modify the first print statement so we can see what would happen if it wasn't cast to a string. If I run this, we'll get a type error because it tells us it can't concatenate an integer to a string. So I change it back and then run the code again. And now everything prints out fine. Everything is being cast to a string, although C, we didn't technically have to cast to a string. But everything else cast to a string, and now everything prints out, including this list right here. So we can even cast lists and tuples and dictionaries to a string. Numeric casting is pretty simple too. First off, integers and floats can be cast to each other. It's important to note, however, that when casting from a float to an integer, you will lose the decimal precision. Casting does not properly round the number. It will simply cut that decimal off. So when you see that variable b, where we're casting 2.78 to an integer, we're just going to get 2. That 0.78 is just going to be cut off. We can also take a string that contains only numeric characters and decimals and cast them to either an integer or a float. As you can see, we've got a string for 12 and a string for 12.48, and we can cast those to both to integers and floats respectively. We could also cast that 12.48 to an integer as well, and like the 2.78, it would drop the 0.48 and we'd be left with 12. Booleans can be cast as well. When you cast a Boolean to numeric, true will always result in 1 or 1.0, and false will always result in 0 and 0.0. So if I run these examples, and I printed out their types next to them so you can see that they have in fact been cast to what we cast them to. So we've got a 1.0, a 2, a 12, a 12.48, all these floats and integers. And then we've got the Boolean values down here. We got 1 and 1.0, and then 0 and 0.0. So everything got cast as we programmed it to be cast. As for Boolean casting, when we cast numeric values to Boolean, it works a little bit differently. 0 will still equate to false no matter what. That's not changed. However, any non-zero number, whether it's negative or positive, will equate to true. Strings can be cast to Boolean as well, but it doesn't work how you think it does, and it's not considered very reliable. It's basically the equivalent of checking whether or not a string is empty. An empty string will always equal to false, but a string with characters in it will always equal to true. So even when we've got a string like this in our code where it says false, that's just going to equate to true because it's not considered an empty string. So if I run this code, the 0, the 0.0, and the empty string all equate to false, and then all the non-zero numbers and the string that says false equate to true. Casting is also possible with data structures, but as I said earlier, I'm only covering simple casting in this video. So I will only talk about lists and tuples because they both have a pretty simple cast. Basically, lists and tuples can be cast to each other. So I've got a tuple right here containing the elements 1, 2, 3, and it's being cast into a list. And then I've got a list right here containing the elements 4, 5, 6, and it's being cast into a tuple. So if I run this tuple here is now a list of 1, 2, 3, and this list here is now a tuple of 4, 5, 6. And that's it for now with casting and the type function. Like I said before, I wanted to keep the casting simple, but as we get farther along in Python, I will cover some more advanced conversions. If you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful, then please hit the like button and leave a comment below to let me know what you think. If you want to see more, head on over to the Wayfair Coding Academy channel to check out my other content. And while you're there, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on new stuff as it comes out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.